So let's just go ahead and get started. Um, Today we have as a guest speaker, as a part of our ongoing Gamry webinars that we do every so often, we have Professor Jeffrey Lopez from the Department of Chemical and Biological Engineering at Northwestern University. He joins us to talk about quite a bit of his work, talking about automated electrochemistry workflows using a Python API that we developed here in Gamry. Um, and so some just real quick notes, we'll take questions at the end. You can message any of the hosts or co-hosts during the presentation and we'll catch them at the end. Keep your webcam and mic off during the presentation, please. And also, just as a heads up, this is going to be an application of the Python API, but we will send a video tutorial on how to install and use the Toolkitpy after the video, probably tomorrow. So with that, to just save some time, please, Jeff, take it away.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Jerome. I really appreciate the invitation, and it's really been great working with Gamry on this, so I'm very excited to share. So morning, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. As Jerome mentioned, I'll talk through a bit of my group's work on automated electrochemical workflows, and then specifically give you all a case study on cyclic voltammetry and EIS and how the Python API from Gamry has really been enabling for us as we've been working in this space. So just to get everyone on the same page, my group works in battery storage or energy storage, and this market is, already exploding and really expected to continue to grow dramatically in the next decade or 15 years, up to about 9 terawatt hours, and that might be an under projection, possibly. And so given the huge volume of energy storage devices that we're going to be making, my group, we think a lot about how do we reduce process intensity to improve yield in battery manufacturing, save energy, and can we identify sustainable and circular materials that don't sacrifice or maybe even improve performance. And so all of this, we think about, we're going to make a lot of these batteries, and so let's do it in the best way that we possibly can. And again, I think folks in the room as electrochemists are probably mostly familiar, but just in case folks are maybe coming in from different application areas, just a quick rundown of an energy storage device. You have an anode or a high energy electrode, high lithium chemical potential, high electron energy. And you have a cathode, which is low lithium chemical potential and low electron energy. And so the core of this device is this separator with either liquid or solid electrolyte that allows ion conduction, but prevents electron conduction and forces those electrons through an external circuit. And so we have a pretty clear roadmap for electrode materials, and there's really, I think, exciting developments in the space with new materials. But one of the things that my group thinks a lot about is what happens when you push these electrodes to very, very high or very, very low energies. So you have a strong driving force for reduction at the anode, or a strong driving force for oxidation at the cathode. And so when you end up pushing the electrodes to these really extreme thermodynamic limits, you end up needing electrolytes that not only are ionically conductive, but you also need them to form passivating layers on these electrode surfaces that allow these devices to kinetically operate in a stable regime, even though thermodynamically your electrolyte's unstable. And so for every new pair of anode and cathode materials, you need to optimize a new electrolyte formulation. And so these electrolytes are really the heart of these devices, and it's a huge combinatorial space. And so you'll see that, this is where we've really pulled on automation to enable this work. So a big picture overview of what my group works on. We think a lot about electrode-electrolyte interfaces. We think a lot about active material and binder interfaces. And as I'm going to talk about today, we also work quite a bit in automating electrochemistry. And so just to give you an overview on where we're at with lithium-ion electrolytes, liquid electrolytes, these are the state-of-the-art in commercial cells. These are high conductivity, but also can be flammable as these organics. Polymers are easy to process, but they have generally pretty poor ionic conductivity. And so there's some issues with improving that ion transport in those materials. And then I think a very exciting area, the ceramic solid ion conductors. These have very high ionic conductivity, but some challenges in processing and manufacturing. But I think there's some really exciting work coming out of startups in this space. So looking forward to kind of seeing where all that ends up. But all this to say, there's a really broad diversity of materials that you can use for electrolytes. And then within each of these classes, you have this really large combinatorial space of different solvents, different salts, different additives, all of their different concentrations and ratios that you can vary. And so it's really, a near infinite space to search for high performance materials. And so that brings us to automation. We think of automation not as replacing scientists in the lab, but instead enabling them to do more of the real hard work that AI and robotics are never going to replace, which is, I think, the idea generation and analysis and communication. And so it lets, I think, our researchers do more with the resources that they do have, and then enables you to kind of go after bigger hypotheses, harder problems, solve those problems more quickly. So we're very excited about applications of automation in this space in particular. We're not the only folks who are working on these automated electrolyte platforms. So these are a couple of examples of different groups across the US and Europe and Asia. What we've noticed from these groups is that they all kind of in common do liquid handling quite well, and they're very good at characterizing these electrolyte properties and even cell cycling. What seems to be remaining challenges are characterization of solid state materials and also solid handling. And if you talk to folks in the automation world, me saying that solid handling is hard is not a new challenge. Folks have known that solid handling is challenging, for the last 30, 35 years. Since automation has come on the scene. But we think we've got some approaches to help address this, and that lets us then formulate electrolytes in a wider space, compositional space. So this is the first of two robotic systems that I'm going to talk about. This one we just published in the journal Matter. This is focused on polymer electrolyte characterization, and it doesn't use the Gamry API, but it will just give you sort of a sense of the scale of these types of research projects. And then we'll dive into a liquid electrolyte robot that does solid and liquid handling that does use the Gamry API. And so we'll spend about half the time here and half the time on that other system. And I'll be happy to answer questions about either. So this robot, you can see this picture here on the bottom of the slide. It's about a 2-meter long deck. It has 2 arms and can do all sorts of solid and liquid handling, transfer, processing. And what I'll show you in a bit is this station on the left here. That's really the heart of the unique piece of this. That's a custom electrochemical workstation. So that will let us do electrochemical impedance spectroscopy on these solid polymer samples that then tells us their ionic conductivity. So our workflow here is we think about what we want to put on the deck. We design these formulations, and then we let the automated system go ahead and formulate, do the solid dispensing and liquid dispensing. We've designed this system so that it can cast and actually dry polymer films with high quality. We do a little bit of quality control with some profilometry, and then we actually make those EIS measurements to get out our ionic conductivity. And similarly, because for polymers, we know the glass transition temperature is really important for the ion transport properties. We also separately prepare DSC pans and then measure those off deck and input those properties into our database of performance, which then we can go back and use in these machine learning loops to optimize as we move forward. So I'll show you a video. We've skipped the boring part, which is mixing powders and watching things dissolve. But this is a formulation of polyethylene oxide with lithium trifluorosulfonamide, so TFSI salt inside in acetonitrile as a solvent. All of this is happening inside an argon glove box, so we don't have to worry about water contaminating our samples. In this system, we use positive displacement pipettes to go ahead and dispense our viscous polymer solution. And these peak caps that you see here are clipped onto stainless steel discs, and they prevent basically the solution from spilling over. Even though it has high viscosity, it can still kind of run over. And so that gives us nice, good control over the films. These caps that you can see, these green caps off to the right here on these blocks, those have two positions. One is an open position where there's a gap between the cap and that red gasket. That allows us to flow gas over, and we can kind of purge these samples as they're drying to help them dry faster. And then there's a closed position that we can actually pull vacuum, and so we can vacuum dry these samples as well. We've skipped the drying part. So after we dry these samples, usually overnight, we can go ahead and take the caps off, and we can move these samples into the critical piece of this equipment. This is all custom and newly developed for our project, which is the quality control and electrochemical characterization. So this is now a dry polymer film. The robot arm is picking up. It's going to put it onto this stage where it's going to go take an optical image and a profilometry trace. We've accelerated that, so we'll just see it snap the picture here and then bring it out. And then we're going to go ahead and put it on an actuator that's a temperature controlled and force controlled stage. So we have temperature control and force control from the bottom of the device. We have a much lower thermal mass than we would typically have in a big bulky cell in an oven outside of the glove box. And so this allows us to make pretty quick measurements. The electrical contacts are made in a 4-point geometry from the top in that twist lock head that you see. And so what we go ahead and do is we just assemble all of these. The robot can do all of that quite quickly. I actually raced it one time with my own hands, and it was able to assemble 4 of these and start making measurements before I even got 3 cells put together and taken out of the glove box. So this is really the precision of these tools, if they're doing the same thing over and over again, can really accelerate the workflow. And like I said, the other accelerator here was that we have a much smaller thermal mass, and so we're able to make temperature scans over much shorter amounts of time. And so that's our overview of the system, and I'll go ahead and walk you through some of the results that we've obtained from this. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is just check to make sure we're not, measuring error or something else. And so the gray and black points here are data taken from the literature. The red points here are data that have been tested manually by hand in sort of a typical process. And the blue here is tested in the automated setup. And you see that, we're all very close together for quite similar concentrations of salt in PEO, well within what I think is, error in the literature from different studies. And so we feel really good that this is giving us trustworthy data. Another interesting thing is, we have a lot of control over how we're making these measurements. And so these measurements I'm showing on the right here were started at high temperature. So started over on the left-hand side, and then the temperature was cooled and the ionic conductivity was measured. And what I want you to notice is this difference between the green and the red lines. So the green line here labeled as full plate is an average of 15 samples, but measured without a temperature delay or a time delay as the temperature is swept. So as soon as we hit the set point, we make the measurement. The red is measured with a 5-minute delay after hitting the set point. And so what we see here as we cross over the freezing transition of polyethylene oxide with a delay, we see a much lower ionic conductivity than if we don't wait for the polymer to freeze. And so what we've actually captured is some of the kinetics of this phase transition of PEO just by simply changing this delay time. And so having fine control over all these properties and really good record keeping lets us do these kind of experiments and also lets us see these kind of outputs. And I think that really is a benefit for reproducibility for these types of studies. To give you some more detail on the actual geometries that we're working with here. So this is the stainless steel base. It's a standard 15mm stainless steel spacer from Coincell. Batteries, we have this custom peak overlay that we snap on. And then we have these 8mm stainless steel top electrodes that we put on. And so the assembled top-down view looks like this. And you can see these 4-point contacts. We make contacts with the bottom from the top over the sides where there's some exposed stainless steel. We have to do a thickness calibration for each individual pair of electrodes. And so we do that by measuring the bare electrode here until we measure some force on the actuator, so that this kind of knee, as we call it, tells us that we've actually made contact with our electrode. And so now we're pushing and compressing our actuator and flexing the load cell. And so this difference between the knee without the film and with the film in blue, that gives us our thickness of our polymer electrolyte. And so we measure that at every temperature for every cell. So we have really, really detailed temperature or thickness information about these electrolytes. In fact, we have such detailed thickness information. This is thickness versus temperature for all these films. We can actually extract thermal expansion coefficients from these polymer electrolyte films. So this is the first time anyone's really, at least we were able to see, made these kind of measurements. And so again, kind of detailed control over what you're doing can be quite beneficial and give you some extra information here. So to the point, really, right? This was all in service of getting after ionic conductivity information. And so we can make these maps of really high quality ionic conductivity measurements. Each of these points that you see, these open circles on the left-hand side there, are measured in at least triplicate and have error bars associated with them. And so we're able to make these contour plots and we can slice them, in a couple of different directions depending on how you're interested in looking at the data. But these are really huge data sets and really high quality. So we're excited for this as training data for future machine learning and AI approaches. We can do this again with sodium as well. In fact, we were quite excited to be able to contribute to the sodium literature. There's much less compared to lithium. And so we think this will be a really useful data set for the field, as well as we start moving into other cations and battery chemistries. And so this is a summary of all of our data. We repeated both lithium and sodium for 4 different salts. You'll see we found solubility limits for things like PF6 and perchlorate anions. And there's some other interesting features. One of the ones that I think is most interesting is for lithium FSI here. The second column, first row, you see this kind of valley at low temperatures where we have very low ionic conductivity, but then we actually pick back up the conductivity. So kind of an interesting feature to observe here, given all the high volume of data that we have. Another interesting thing that we found, and this is what we were really most excited about from this study, is that when we went ahead and looked at all these different salts at the same time, and we measured all their glass transition temperatures, we saw that because we had such a kind of fine screen of these compositional spaces, we were actually able to catch what we've called this dip in the glass transition temperature. And so there's a local minimum in the glass transition temperature at effectively the same concentration, no matter what salt, anion or cation, we were using in this study. And we would have missed this, I think, if we hadn't had such a large volume of samples prepared. And so we went ahead and did a little bit more detailed work, and we took a lot of data points right near this local minimum. And what we see is that this corresponds to the maximum in ionic conductivity and also corresponds to the point where we lose the crystallinity of the PEO backbone. And so what we think is happening here is effectively as you're adding salt, you're starting to break up the crystallites of the PEO and kind of dissolve them with the anions that you've put in that want to interact with the polymer chain, the polymer backbone. And your best conductivity is going to happen right when you dissolve all of those crystallites. And then as you start adding more salt past that point, you actually start ionically cross-linking with cations your polymer matrix. And then that actually causes you to reduce your segmental motion, increase your glass transition temperature, and reduce your ion transport through lower mobility, even though you have higher concentration. And so this was interesting to find, and it was really interesting for us that this was true for all of the different salts that we tested, both sodium and lithium salts. And so this is really a colligative property just of the PEO itself, which we thought was quite interesting. We can go ahead and use all of this to then do machine learning approaches. So we generated a big data set from the literature, about 15,000 entries. It's published online. So if you're in the polymer electrolyte space, definitely go take a look at this. It's one of the bigger data sets that's out in the literature. And we can train models. The model that we published here is this ChemR model. What we did is we just pinned the ionic conductivity to the Arrhenius equation because we know that is how the temperature dependence of these systems evolves. And so that improves, you can see it kind of tightens the predictions here a little bit and brings this tail at low conductivity down to be more accurate. And we went ahead and tested this model against some relatively exotic polymer structures that our collaborators synthesized. And they were synthesized not necessarily to be good polymer electrolytes, but were synthesized to be very different than anything the model had seen before. And we still have what I think is quite good predictive power for these types of structures. And so now you can run structures through the model, see if they're going to be good before you actually have to go through all the work of synthesizing a polymer and testing different concentrations of salt. So with that, I'm going to switch gears now to our liquid electrolyte system that's newer. We haven't published on this yet. And I'll share some more details about the Python API. And I'll just, before I make that transition, say that this data that you've seen here from this polymer electrolyte work, wasn't gathered using Gamry tools. And without saying too much, there were a lot of challenges in setting up the electrochemical measurements and working with the API from this system. And so, I really have appreciated the ease at which with which you can work with the Gamry setup. It's very straightforward in Python and very stable. And so, just to give you kind of a point of reference that I've done this before without the Gamry API, and from experience know that it really has made things quite a bit easier. So this is our new system. It's a bit smaller than the one that I showed you before, so about half the size and a different kind of robotic arm. So instead of an XYZ with linear axes, it's got these two rotating motors, and so it accesses this hemispherical space on the deck. But we have solid and liquid dispensing, we have heating and stirring. Because these are liquid electrolytes, we don't have as much processing equipment here on this deck. And then we have electrochemical sensors, which I'll talk about in detail, and I'll skip over talking about this Coulombic efficiency cell today. So we'll just talk about EIS and cyclic voltammetry. But this entire robot, all of this is orchestrated in Python, which again sort of makes it nice to work with this API that's in Python. We don't have to leave that environment. We can just call commands directly in our orchestration code. So we've designed two low-cost custom sensors. We have a 2-electrode EIS setup. Its volume is about 10 microliters. We really wanted to minimize volume in this setup so that we weren't wasting electrolyte material. And then we have a 3-electrode cell for voltammetry experiments that has a volume of about 100 microliters made out of PEEK. So these are, relatively straightforward to machine or buy. And put together, and they give us nice, robust data, as I'll show you here in a little bit. So the first one we're going to talk about is this EIS setup. And so I wanted to jump in and talk a bit about the pieces of performing this galvanostatic EIS measurement in the Gamry API. And so the first thing that we do in our code is we actually call this initializing Python file, this galvanostatic EIS file. So that basically sends a signal to the potentiostat that says, hey, we're going to make this kind of measurement, get ready to receive a particular set of inputs that we're going to give you to actually make that measurement. And so we set that up, and now the potentiostat's ready to talk to us. We then have a file that my students have put together. We call it GEIS, but it takes all of the bits of the Gamry API and is a way that we then can keep track of all of the instrument settings. And so some of these settings are things that we don't really care to change. They're relatively static, and so those just stay as fixed parameters inside this file. If we ever need to edit them in the future, we can go in and make these changes. And then other pieces of this file are actually inputs that it takes from our code, which are things that we might want to change, right? For example, amplitudes, frequency limits, points per decade, all of the kind of normal stuff that you would change in an EIS experiment from sample to sample, we're able to change here quite easily. And this is really, this layer is kind of our quasi-static layer, but is entirely customizable. So we've kind of built this up to work for us. But everybody, I think, using this would have their own kind of needs, and so there's a lot of flexibility here, which I've really appreciated, to kind of do anything you want. And then this last layer sits inside of our experiment orchestration file. So this is a giant Python file that actually runs the whole start to finish dispensing, mixing, sampling, runs all the pumps and the motors and the heaters and the arm. and all of these different pieces. And so again, it's quite nice to not have to leave Python and communicate with some other coding language or some other environment. And so these user design files then can just get called in our Python workflow that then go ahead and make these measurements, send the data back, and then that data gets thrown into a database. And so just to kind of say the same thing in another way, we create an experiment plan. We like to use CSVs to do this. So we have sometimes if we're running these automated loops, these self-driving setups, we can actually generate these experimental files automatically, or a student can sit down and just plug in numbers of things that they want to make measurements of. And then that goes ahead and runs in the program, and then we collect the data as you can see here. And so here's just a few of the EIS parameters. And again, you can see, some of these are things that we maybe wouldn't want to change, right? Their gain, our noise, things that maybe we're not going to play with for most setups, whereas things like frequency limits, initial frequency, amplitudes, file names, all of that sort of stuff we're going to be changing from sample to sample. And so again, we have the flexibility to kind of be as in the weeds as we want or as high level as we want. And that's also nice for kind of the general user of this automated equipment. We can abstract away a lot of the detail so that they're only really interfacing with the things that they need to be thinking about and aren't overwhelmed with too much information. So when we calibrate this two electrode setup, we do that using a standard approach with potassium chloride standards in water. And so here's just some data from 50 millisiemens per centimeter and a 1 millisiemens per centimeter sample, and we can then go ahead and use this to calculate a cell constant. We get a little bit of noise, but again, these are sort of low fidelity, high throughput measurements, so we're pretty happy even with this range of cell constant. And then we can go ahead and make measurements. Another nice thing about having all of this in Python is that we also can automatically process our data on the same pipeline. And so what we do here is we have some code that we run, again, in Python to do the impedance fitting of these Nyquist plots and equivalent circuits. We then extract out a resistance that we have equated to the ionic resistance across that two electrode device. Here we measure samples in triplicate, and we drop the first sample just in case there's any cross-contamination between that first sample and whatever was flowing through before it. We also do a little bit of washing in the middle, but we found that we get better reliability if we just take these second and third runs. We go ahead and average these two numbers and use the cell constant to then get a conductivity. And then we save this averaged value. But the other thing that we can do, and we like, is we save all these individual resistance values. We save the other bits of the equivalent circuit that we've measured. And we also save the raw impedance data. And so we're not really losing any ability to process anything, but we're also getting a nice, clean, structured data set out from this in a way that lets us really, only go into the details if we feel like there's an error, or if we feel like we need to, or we're interested in rerunning an analysis. So let's say we come up with a new way to process this, or we're interested in extracting something else. We can go back and reprocess all the data in a pretty straightforward way. And so again, it's just really nice to have this very structured data set here. So this is just to give you an example of kind of the breadth of samples that we're able to run. So our robot has mixed up, I think we've got 4 different salts on this figure at a variety of concentrations, all the way up to like a 19 molal solution here with the TFSI and acetate. And you can see that's where we have kind of this higher conductivity point, likely from either some water or some of this perchlorate sample being retained in the cell before flattening out. And so all of this data collection happened autonomously. All of these samples were formulated autonomously, and they just ran in a loop. So my student set this up. It takes a couple of hours to set up all the vials and the materials and things, and then you just press play and you go about your day, and you've collected a lot of data. And so this really lets us expand the breadth of samples that we're characterizing here. And an important thing we just wanted to check, so we ran the same sample at the beginning and the end, and we see that there's not really drift. We do this periodically over days and weeks, and we see that overall this system is quite robust with pretty little error and pretty little drift over time. So we're quite excited about this. And again, this was really enabled by kind of the ease of use of this Gamry API that we've had access to. The other thing I'll say maybe about these students, so you definitely don't need to be an expert software engineer to deploy this. This has been deployed with a material science PhD student who's very, very talented and wears a lot of hats on this project. And then in collaboration with a second year undergraduate computer science major. And so, you can really get away with, folks who are not necessarily PhD level computer scientists to go ahead and deploy this. And I think it's very straightforward and very robust and very transparent, which again has been quite nice. So we'll go ahead and jump over to the cyclic voltammetry measurements, and I'll give you kind of the same sort of flavor, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. So again, with the CV, we go ahead and initialize the potentiostat, and we tell it, hey, we're going to be making a voltage measurement or a current measurement here with this open circuit file. And then we similarly have a file that my students have written to keep track of all these instrument settings. Here, things like cutoffs, both voltage and current, scan rates, all of that sort of stuff. And then again, all of that sits inside our experimental orchestration file and can take inputs during that file. So you could even actually imagine dynamic experimentation where based on something you measured before, you might make a different measurement in the future. That's all possible here, given the way that this API is structured. So very, very flexible and very, very robust. We then again, create this experiment plan in a CSV. We run the automation program. We collect the data. We get, nice standard looking CV data and just again a couple of different file parameters that we can change here. And it's everything you would expect to be able to change from a typical, CV experiment on a potentiostat. Just to give you a little bit more detail on our 3 electrode setups, this is a flow through 3 electrode. You're looking kind of down the axis where the liquid is flowing. We have platinum working in counters in this particular set of experiments. This is all aqueous electrolytes. And then we have a lithium iron phosphate reference that sort of is positioned so that it's between the working encounter, but doesn't interfere with the flow path very much. And we just went ahead and tested an electrolyte here versus a standard, 3 electrode cell that we have in the lab. We get really good agreement, again, between these 2 setups. So we're quite pleased with that. So again, you can generate an automated pipeline for analysis. So we've decided that we want to pull out the overpotentials at plus and minus 1 milliamp per centimeter squared. So we process the raw current into a current density. We then go ahead and find those points at plus and minus 1, and we extract those points and we take the difference of them, and that's we call our electrochemical stability window. We then take that window, again, we average the second and third, and we save that to the database. So here we're seeing about a 2.3 volt window, but then we also retain the individual potentials, we retain the curves, all of these different things. And so again, if we ever want to reprocess this data, it's very straightforward to do that. And all of the raw data, all of the metadata is associated with a particular sample in our database. And so we aren't losing. In fact, we're gaining, I think, a lot of resolution and reproducibility over the long run. Again, we can collect, lots and lots of data. I think here we're seeing, again, fairly good reproducibility. This point here for the 19 molal or 19.5 molal solution, I think that's a great example of why we throw out that first data point. You can see here it's much, much, much lower than the other 2 data points, again, likely due to some sort of cross-contamination. And again, these repeated lithium nitrate samples don't really show a lot of drift. And so we're quite pleased with reproducibility for this system. And so all of this has really enabled us to dramatically increase the output of our characterization in this space. So hundreds of electrolyte formulations can get screened over the matter of weeks with really minimal PhD student effort. And so this is just a sampling of some of the data points. And then all of this can get paired with AI and ML workflows to then have self-driving lab setups and optimization approaches. And we're really excited to kind of see where this will go in the future. But overall, we think very, very promising and relatively straightforward to implement in our space. And so just to summarize, I've talked to you about this ionic conductivity and electrochemical stability window testing setup that we've got here. It's able to formulate electrolytes autonomously, and in particular, this Gamry Python API lets us really integrate these electrochemical measurements in a seamless way. And that fits really nicely with then our automated analysis pipeline and file transfer to databases, all kind of within Python. And so with that, I want to thank the folks on the left who I worked with on that first polymer electrolyte system, and then want to thank my group on the right here, where we've built up this liquid electrolyte system. In particular, want to give a shout out to Guillermo Masaka. He's a fourth-year PhD candidate in the group. He's really been the heart and soul of this project. Extremely talented student. He'll be graduating in about a year, so if folks are looking to hire an expert in this automation space, he'll be on the market. And I want to thank both internal funding and Research Corporation for funding for this project, and other sponsors of the group. And then finally, I want to thank Jerome and the rest of the Gamry team. This was a long conversation and a back and forth to get access to this Python API. And so we really appreciate access to the beta version of this. It's been really helpful for us, and it's been really great to work with the Gamry team. So really appreciate all their efforts and for setting this up today. And with that, we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So I'll look forward to any questions that folks might have about any of this. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff, for a great presentation and for your work on the electrolytes for batteries in both the solid and liquid. While people are just thinking about some questions, I was listening to you talk, and I was wondering, because not everybody's going to be in the battery space and
Yeah.
electrolytes, in this webinar, and they might be interested in all of this automation. How much, and you kind of touched on it, but like how much effort does it really take to kind of get to this level of automation?
Yeah, I
Maybe,
think
yeah,
it
just,
depends on a few different things. It depends on what your comfort level is with kind of mechanical engineering and machine shop and sort of putting together different pieces. I could give you a tour of sort of all the little custom elements that we have on this deck, even in this picture that you're seeing. I do think if you have the right amount of funds, more money can buy you sort of more polished equipment as well. So we've kind of done this in a pretty bare bones way because we were really comfortable doing a lot of it ourselves. And that saves us quite a bit of money, but does take a little bit more effort than on our end. But I really like that approach because then the custom bits are really exactly what we want them to be. So I think there definitely is a bit of a learning curve, but once you're there, it can be quite quick. So actually, just to give you an example, we've started having conversations with some folks in our department who do electrocatalysis. And so to modify this setup, but then to make measurements of electrocatalysts for oxygen evolution reaction. And that I think is going to be a very straightforward transition now that we have all the code and all of the hardware up and running. And so we're very excited about that, but it should be a quick pivot now that this platform set up.
right, right. So we have a few questions. Thank you. So the first question, touches on, I don't know if you can see them actually.
Yeah, I'm scrolling through the chat, but you can go ahead and moderate. I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah. There's a question about the ML and deep learning, as a way to kind of collect samples, like choose your experimental parameters and probably analyze the results.
Yeah,
How do you?
yeah, happy to talk about that. So we have used very, very basic, I wouldn't even call it necessarily ML, but just optimization approaches for now. So this is a relatively lean proof of concept to start, but we're using Bayesian optimization approaches. We're collaborating with some folks in mechanical engineering who are optimization experts to do that. Wei Chen in particular has been a great collaborator. But I think this is really about generating data in a structured format, and given the right structure and size of a data set, you can then use that for any sort of training approach that you want. And obviously you want to go to a neural network or something like that, you need sort of thousands or tens of thousands of data points. Whereas if you want to do, things like Bayesian optimization, you can get away with tens of data points. And so I think the level of ML and the types of algorithms you want to deploy really depend on what size and quality of data you have. And that's really where we were hoping to contribute, right? We were really excited to put all this out when we're getting it published, and we'll share that with the field. And so we hope that folks can then use that as a foundation to go ahead and train bigger and better models that will then let the whole field move more quickly.
Right. And a lot of those tools are in a Python environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I would
Yeah.
say Python is the go-to ML code. So coding
Right.
language.
So, yeah, exactly. So it kind of just mates the hardware with the software and the analysis all in one space, I would
Yeah,
say.
couldn't agree more.
Yeah. All right. So the next question, and I think I can speak to that, it's a question on, how do you get access to the Python or run the Python, whether it's in the framework or, yeah, elsewhere. So basically, this is not in the Gamry framework. This is adjacent to it. And right? You will check the instrument is working in framework, I suppose, the potentiostat itself, but then otherwise, you would call it and give it commands and request it to run certain curves like EIS or run cyclic voltammetry. And then it would basically store that data in like a NumPy table and that you could get access to that and then save it and print it as you need. So that's how it works. There is a related question that asks about, you know, how do you get access to the API? You can contact Gamry. You can contact us for that. Okay, so let's see. I'm just trying to digest here. So we have a question about, let's see, Python's grid search function to determine optimum limits for fitting a Tafel curve. So I guess this is now heading into more of a, away from the electrolytes and the
Yeah, that's
conductivity
great though.
and
We do those sorts of IV measurements as well for kinetic stuff. So yeah, I think absolutely you could, right? All that requires is you to have the right electrochemical cell setup that's going to give you a good kinetic measurement, um, and then to be hooked up to a computer and a potentiostat. And really, you could set that up to run till the cows come home, basically. If your electrode's not going to foul, if your electrolytes got what you're looking for, you can run that lots of scan rates, different voltage limits, all sorts of different ways that you could imagine. And yeah, it would be as straightforward as setting up or using the code to kind of generate these different inputs to whatever experiment file you're running. And so, like I said, we do this a little bit kind of in our optimization approach where we have a little bit of a script to then generate the CSV file. The students like to check still. We're not quite to the point where we trust it to just run on its own yet, but there's no reason that you can't get there. Absolutely.
right. And it's very much on how much time you want to spend on building up that code and the sequence, and kind of it's left to your imagination what you can do. Given the tools or the functions embedded in the API, of course. But it does kind of like speak to, I think a lot of it's going to touch on, as you build up this more advanced automated platform, there's a couple things, and maybe you can speak to it, is like error handling. You
Yeah,
touched on the electrode fouling, right? So there are some limitations in terms of the actual electrodes themselves.
yeah.
So how do you handle that? Um, yeah,
Yeah, so we think quite a bit about that. We Right now, I think our approach, once we move to the non-aqueous systems, which, basically you get one measurement and then you're absolutely fouled and you need a new electrode. We think we're gonna multiplex basically. So instead of using a single electrode for all of our measurements, we'll basically have a bunch of single-use electrodes all multiplexed together in the cell. And so we'll switch from one to the other as we make measurements, and we'll be basically limited by um, how many electrodes we can cram into this. And so this would be these like microelectrode arrays, which folks use mostly for kind of neurobiology and things like that. So these are creative hardware solutions. If you wanted to, another hardware approach would be to figure out a way to get your robot to clean your electrode surface. I don't necessarily, that's not the route we chose, but if somebody can solve that, we'd be happy to, call you up for the design and implement it. So yeah, I think you're really kind of just limited by what you can do with the hardware and what you can dream up on the software side. But I think sky's the limit with this.
Right. Yeah. I just, and it's something that on the Gamry side, I think took us quite a while to just hammer out some of the error handling on the API side. Because it takes some time to figure out. And actually, that's why it was quite helpful working with you and your group too, because a lot of the things that you found is not some you found during the actual implementation
Hmm.
is not stuff that we would typically find within Gamry because, we don't have access to this kind of automation or level of hardware.
Yeah.
So, all right, we have another question. It's talking about, yeah. So, when you're talking about this API, and so the question is, if you can make a sequence with the API, and do you create a script to run something like ZRA mode and noise, or and all these parameters. So, I can speak to that, Jeff. It's basically, what you're doing in the API is creating an experimental, like a Python file, or basically you're recreating what you would typically use in framework. That's basically one way to look at it. Um, you know, so I think there's, and I can reach out. We can discuss this offline. Um, so another question was talking about, what the API can and cannot do. So I can speak to that too. So this Toolkitpy basically can control any of your Gamry equipment. This includes all the different potentiostats, and it does include the multiplexer as well. And so, as long as the instrument is communicating to the PC that's overall in control of the whole system, then you can call the API. Um, yeah. So there was another question about how to correlate Z real and Z imaginary. Um, I'm not sure if you can clarify on that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what correlate means
Right.
necessarily here. Um, while maybe we're waiting on that, basically we input a frequency and we measure the real and imaginary components of the impedance that respond to that particular frequency and amplitude. Um, and so they're intrinsically correlated through the complex analysis. Hopefully
So
that answers it.
yeah. Oh, wait for that. So going back to the kind of the science behind all this, or like that was the main intent here. So you mentioned this dip in what was the
Yeah,
transition.
it's glass transition temperature for the polymer electrolytes, absolutely.
So is that something that you actually were looking for,
No, so
or
that's I think one of the
okay?
really kind of great parts about
Sir, I need a curve explained by the sir. That is the curve plot between Z and Z double dash.
sure, the
And that
Nyquist
curve,
plots, I
yeah,
think.
yeah, yeah, that curve would be red and green, I suppose. What Jeffrey told earlier, that red and green color curves are there. Yeah. So I am more precise about the analysis of Z and Z double dash. I am Professor Dr. Neeraj Marwa from India.
So what's the question?
Yeah, how we correlate, sir, Z and Z double dash? Earlier you told it is an impedance matching, but I am not sure because
No, there.
these curve, yeah, yeah, these curves are too different and too analytical as well as logical.
Yeah, so these are impedance measurements. Both Z prime and Z double prime are functions of frequency that
Yeah,
and
yeah,
amplitude, which are inputs.
we can correlate with frequency because it is an impedance matching, I suppose, because one is transpose of other, if I'm not wrong.
No, we measure a complex impedance, and then that complex impedance can be decomposed into real and
Yeah, yeah,
imaginary components.
that should be in transpose matrix, I suppose.
Uh, perhaps I'm actually not sure how Gamry decides to
Okay.
decompose on the high
Okay,
Yeah.
level.
yeah, there would be a little confusion when you show your graph red and green. That is the reason I asked this question.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah, Jerome, we were chatting about kind of the dip and finding that. You know, I think that's really kind of one of the exciting bits of this is you can search much broader spaces with much more detail and I think find sort of more complex um, results and I think more detailed, more nuanced um, results. And so I see this as just really an exciting time for the field and really exciting opportunities um, for us to learn more and get better at, you know, solving these problems that we're all trying to solve.
right, right. Yeah. So I think that's a perfect kind of conclusion to the webinar today. Thanks, Jeff, for fielding these questions
Oh, happy to.
and
Yeah.
and giving us a nice look at automation as a whole. Um, I think just like as I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, I will actually send out a video tutorial about how to actually do this. And if you have a potentiostat, one of our potentiostats anyways, you can even run the VFP to program through Toolkitpy, the API. So, but with that, I'm going to close out the webinar and the meeting. So thank you everybody for joining. You will get